Chapter 1 of the Rainbow Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Kilmer. The Rainbow Trail by Zane Grey. Red Lake. Shefford halted his tired horse and gazed with slowly realizing eyes. A league-long slope of sage rolled and billowed down to Red Lake, a dry red basin, denuded and glistening, a hollow in the desert, a lonely and desolate door to the vast wild and broken upland beyond. All day Shefford had plodded onward with the clear horizon line a thing unattainable, and for days before he had ridden the wild bare flats and climbed the rocky desert benches. The great colored reaches and steppes had led endlessly onward and upward through dim and deceiving distance. 100 miles of desert travel, with its mistakes and lessons and intimations, had not prepared him for what he now saw. He beheld what seemed a world that knew only magnitude. Wonder and awe fixed his gaze, and thought remained aloof. Then that dark and unknown northland flung a menace at him. An irresistible call had drawn him to this seamed and peaked border of Arizona, this broken battlement wilderness of Utah upland. And at first sight they had frowned upon him, as if to warn him not to search for what lay hidden beyond the ranges. But Shefford thrilled with both fear and exultation. This was the country which had been described to him. Far across the red valley, far beyond the ragged line of black mesa and yellow range, lay the wild cañon with its haunting secret. Red Lake must be his Rubicon. Either he must enter the unknown to seek, to strive, to find, or turn back and fail, and never know, and be always haunted. A friend's strange story had prompted his singular journey. A beautiful rainbow with its mystery and promise had decided him. Once in his life he had answered a wild call to the kingdom of adventure within him, and once in his life he had been happy. But here in the horizon-wide face of that upflung and cloven desert he grew cold. He faltered even while he felt more fatally drawn. As if impelled, Shefford started his horse down the sandy trail, but he checked his former far-reaching gaze. It was the month of April, and the waning sun lost heat and brightness. Long shadows crept down the slope ahead of him, and the scant sage deepened its gray. He watched the lizards shoot like brown streaks across the sand, leaving their slender tracks. He heard the rustle of pack rats as they darted into their brushy homes. The whir of a low sailing hawk startled his horse. Like ocean waves the slope rose and fell, its hollows choked with sand, its ridge tops showing scantier growth of sage and grass and weed. The last ridge was a sand dune, beautifully ribbed and scalloped and lined by the wind, and from its knife-sharp crest a thin, wavering sheet of sand blew, almost like smoke. Shefford wondered why the sand looked red at a distance, for here it seemed almost white. It rippled everywhere, clean and glistening, always leading down. Suddenly Shefford became aware of a house looming out of the barrenness of the slope. It dominated that long white incline. Grim, lonely, forbidding, how strangely it harmonized with the surroundings. The structure was octagon-shaped, built of uncut stone, and resembled a fort. There was no door on the sides exposed to Shefford's gaze, but small apertures 2/3 of the way up probably served as windows and portholes. The roof appeared to be made of poles covered with red earth. Like a huge cold rock on a wide plain, this house stood there on the windy slope. It was the outpost of the trader Presby, of whom Shefford had heard at Flagstaff and Tuba. No living thing appeared in the limit of Shefford's vision. He gazed shudderingly at the unwelcoming habitation, and at the dark eye-like windows, at the sweep of barren slope merging into the vast red valley, at the bold, bleak bluffs. Could anyone live here? The nature of that sinister valley forbade a home there, and the spirit of the place hovered in the silence and space. Shefford thought irresistibly of how his enemies would have consigned him to just such a hell. He thought bitterly and mockingly of the narrow congregation that had proved him a failure in the ministry, that had repudiated his ideas of religion and immortality and God, that had driven him at the age of 24 from the calling forced upon him by his people. As a boy he had yearned to make himself an artist. His family had made him a clergyman. Fate had made him a failure only so far in his life. Something urged him to add, for in the lonely days and silent nights of the desert he had experienced a strange birth of hope. Adventure had called him, but it was a vague and spiritual hope, a dream of promise, a nameless attainment that fortified his wilder impulse. As he rode around the corner of the stone house, his horse snorted and stopped. A lean, shaggy pony jumped at the sight of him, almost displacing a red, long-haired blanket that covered an Indian saddle. Quick thuds of hoofs in sand drew Shefford's attention to a corral made of peeled poles, and here he saw another pony. Shefford heard subdued voices. He dismounted and walked to an open door. In the dark interior he dimly descried a high counter, a stairway, a pile of bags of flour, blankets, and silver-ornamented objects. But the persons he had heard were not in that part of the house. Around another corner of the octagon-shaped wall he found another open door, and through it saw goatskins and a mound of dirty sheep wool, black and brown and white. It was light in this part of the building. When he crossed the threshold he was astounded to see a man struggling with a girl, an Indian girl. She was straining back from him, panting and uttering low guttural sounds. The man's face was corded and dark with passion. The scene affected Shefford strangely. Primitive emotions were new to him. Before Shefford could speak, the girl broke loose and turned to flee. She was an Indian, and this place was the uncivilized desert, but Shefford knew terror when he saw it. Like a dog the man rushed after her. It was instinct that made Shefford strike, and his blow laid the man flat. He lay stunned a moment, then raised himself to a sitting posture, his hand to his face, and the gaze he fixed upon Shefford seemed to combine astonishment and rage. "I hope you're not Presby," said Shefford slowly. He felt awkward, not sure of himself. The man appeared about to burst into speech, but repressed it. There was blood on his mouth and his hand. Hastily he scrambled to his feet. Shefford saw this man's amaze and rage change to shame. He was tall and rather stout. He had a smooth, tanned face, soft of outline, with a weak chin. His eyes were dark. The look of him in his corduroys and his soft shoes gave Shefford an impression that he was not a man who worked hard. By contrast with the few other worn and rugged desert men Shefford had met, this stranger stood out strikingly. He stooped to pick up a soft felt hat, and, jamming it on his head, he hurried out. Shefford followed him and watched him from the door. He went directly to the corral, mounted the pony, and rode out, to turn down the slope toward the south. When he reached the level of the basin, where evidently the sand was hard, he put the pony to a lope and gradually drew away. "Well," ejaculated Shefford. He did not know what to make of this adventure. Presently he became aware that the Indian girl was sitting on a roll of blankets near the wall. With curious interest Shefford studied her appearance. She had long, raven black hair, tangled and disheveled. She wore a soiled white band of cord above her brow. The color of her face struck him. It was dark, but not red nor bronzed. It almost had a tinge of gold. Her profile was clear-cut, bold, almost stern. Long black eyelashes hid her eyes. She wore a tight-fitting waist garment of material resembling velveteen. It was ripped along her side, exposing a skin still more richly gold than that of her face. A string of silver ornaments and turquoise and white beads encircled her neck, and it moved gently up and down with the heaving of her full bosom. Her skirt was some gaudy print goods, torn and stained and dusty. She had little feet, encased in brown moccasins, fitting like gloves and buttoning over the ankles with silver coins. "Who was that man? Did he hurt you?" inquired Shefford, turning to gaze down the valley where a moving black object showed on the bare sand. "No savvy," replied the Indian girl. "Where's the trader Presby?" asked Shefford. She pointed straight down into the red valley. "Toh," she said. In the center of the basin lay a small pool of water, shining brightly in the sunset glow. Small objects moved around it, so small that Shefford thought he saw several dogs led by a child. But it was the distance that deceived him. There was a man down there watering his horses. That reminded Shefford of a duty owing to his own tired and thirsty beast. Whereupon he untied his pack, took off the saddle, and was about ready to start down when the Indian girl grasped the bridle from his hand. "Me go," she said. He saw her eyes then, and they made her look different. They were as black as her hair. He was puzzled to decide whether or not he thought her handsome. "Thanks, but I'll go," he replied, and taking the bridle again, he started down the slope. At every step he sank into the deep, soft sand. Down a little way he came upon a pile of tin cans. They were everywhere, buried, half buried, and lying loose, and these gave evidence of how the trader lived. Presently Shefford discovered that the Indian girl was following him with her own pony. Looking upward at her against the light, he thought her slender, lithe, picturesque. At a distance he liked her. He plodded on, at length glad to get out of the drifts of sand to the hard, level floor of the valley. This, too, was sand, but dried and baked hard and red in color. At some season of the year this immense flat must be covered with water. How wide it was and empty! Shefford experienced again a feeling that had been novel to him, and it was that he was loose, free, unanchored, ready to veer with the wind. From the foot of the slope the water hole had appeared to be a few hundred rods out in the valley, but the small size of the figures made Shefford doubt, and he had to travel many times a few hundred rods before those figures began to grow. Then Shefford made out that they were approaching him. Thereafter they rapidly increased to normal proportions of man and beast. When Shefford met them he saw a powerful, heavily built young man leading two ponies. "You're Mr. Presby, the trader?" inquired Shefford. "Yes, I'm Presby, without the mister," he replied. "My name's Shefford. I'm knocking about on the desert. Rode from beyond Tuba today." "Glad to see you," said Presby. He offered his hand. He was a stalwart man, clad in gray shirt, overalls, and boots. A shock of tumbled light hair covered his massive head. He was tanned, but not darkly, and there was red in his cheeks. Under his shaggy eyebrows were deep, keen eyes. His lips were hard and set, as if occasion for smile or words was rare, and his big, strong jaw seemed locked. "Wish more travelers came knocking around Red Lake," he added. "Reckon here's the jumping off place." "It's pretty lonesome," said Shefford, hesitating as if at a loss for words. Then the Indian girl came up. Presby addressed her in her own language, which Shefford did not understand. She seemed shy and would not answer. She stood with downcast face and eyes. Presby spoke again, at which she pointed down the valley and then moved on with her pony toward the water hole. Presby's keen eyes fixed on the receding black dot far down that oval expanse. "That fellow left rather abruptly," said Shefford constrainedly. "Who was he?" "His name's Willetts. He's a missionary. He rode in today with this Navajo girl. He was taking her to Blue Cañon, where he lives and teaches the Indians. I've met him only a few times. You see, not many white men ride in here. He's the first white man I've seen in 6 months, and you're the second. Both the same day. Red Lake's getting popular. It's queer, though, his leaving. He expected to stay all night. There's no other place to stay. Blue Cañon is 50 miles away. I'm sorry to say. No, I'm not sorry either. But I must tell you I was the cause of Mr. Willetts leaving, replied Shefford. How so? Inquired the other. Then Shefford related the incident following his arrival. Perhaps my action was hasty, he concluded apologetically. I didn't think. Indeed, I'm surprised at myself. Presby made no comment, and his face was as hard to read as one of the distant bluffs. But what did that man mean? Asked Shefford, conscious of a little heat. I'm a stranger out here. I'm ignorant of Indians, how they're controlled. Still, I'm no fool. If Willetts didn't mean evil, at least he was brutal. He was teaching her religion, replied Presby. His tone held faint scorn and implied a joke, but his face did not change in the slightest. Without understanding just why, Shefford felt his conviction justified and his action approved. Then he was sensible of a slight shock of wonder and disgust. I was a minister of the gospel, he said to Presby. What you hint seems impossible. I can't believe it. I didn't hint, replied Presby bluntly, and it was evident that he was a sincere but close-mouthed man. Shefford, so you're a preacher. Did you come out here to try to convert the Indians? No, I said I was a minister. I am no longer. I'm just a wanderer. I see. Well, the desert's no place for missionaries, but it's good for wanderers. Go water your horse and take him up to the corral. You'll find some hay for him. I'll get grub ready. Shefford went on with his horse to the pool. The water appeared thick, green, murky, and there was a line of salty crust extending around the margin of the pool. The thirsty horse splashed in and eagerly bent his head, but he did not like the taste. Many times he refused to drink, yet always lowered his nose again. Finally he drank, though not his fill. Shefford saw the Indian girl drink from her hand. He scooped up a handful and found it too sour to swallow. When he turned to retrace his steps, she mounted her pony and followed him. A golden flare lit up the western sky, and silhouetted dark and lonely against it stood the trading post. Upon his return, Shefford found the wind rising, and it chilled him. When he reached the slope, thin gray sheets of sand were blowing low, rising, whipping, falling, sweeping along with soft silken rustle. Sometime the gray veils hid his boots. It was a long, toilsome climb up that yielding, dragging ascent, and he had already been lame and tired. By the time he had put his horse away, twilight was everywhere except in the west. The Indian girl left her pony in the corral and came like a shadow toward the house. Shefford had difficulty in finding the foot of the stairway. He climbed to enter a large loft, lighted by 2 lamps. Presby was there, kneading biscuit dough in a pan. "Make yourself comfortable," he said. The huge loft was the shape of a half octagon. A door opened upon the valley side, and here, too, there were windows. How attractive the place was in comparison with the impressions gained from the outside! The furnishings consisted of Indian blankets on the floor, 2 beds, a desk and table, several chairs, and a couch, a gun rack full of rifles, innumerable silver ornamented belts, bridles, and other Indian articles upon the walls, and in one corner a wood-burning stove with tea kettle steaming, and a great cupboard with shelves packed full of canned food. Shefford leaned in the doorway and looked out. Beneath him, on a roll of blankets, sat the Indian girl, silent and motionless. He wondered what was in her mind, what she would do. how the trader would treat her. The slope now was a long slant of sheeted, moving shadows of sand. Dusk had gathered in the valley. The bluffs loomed beyond. A pale star twinkled above. Shefford suddenly became aware of the intense nature of the stillness about him. Yet as he listened to this silence he heard an intermittent and immeasurably low moan, a fitful, mournful murmur. Assuredly it was only the wind. Nevertheless, it made his blood run cold. It was a different wind from that which had made music under the eaves of his Illinois home. This was a lonely, haunting wind, with desert hunger in it, and more which he could not name. Shefford listened to this spirit-brooding sound while he watched night envelop the valley. How black, how thick the mantle! Yet it brought no comforting sense of close folded protection, of walls of soft sleep, of a home. Instead, there was a feeling of space, of emptiness, of an infinite hall down which a mournful wind swept streams of murmuring sand. "Well, grub's about ready," said Presby. "Got any water?" asked Shefford. "Sure, there in the bucket. It's rainwater. I have a tank here." Shefford's sore and blistered face felt better after he had washed off the sand and alkali dust. "Better not wash your face often while you're in the desert. Bad plan," went on Presby, noting how gingerly his visitor had gone about his ablutions. "Well, come and eat." Shefford marked that if the trader did live a lonely life, he fared well. There was more on the table than twice two men could have eaten. It was the first time in 4 days that Shefford had sat at a table, and he made up for lost opportunity. His host's actions indicated pleasure, yet the strange, hard face never relaxed, never changed. When the meal was finished, Presby declined assistance. He had a generous thought of the Indian girl, who he said could have a place to eat and sleep downstairs, and then, with the skill and dispatch of an accomplished housewife, cleared the table, after which work he filled a pipe and evidently prepared to listen. It took only one question for Shefford to find that the trader was starved for news of the outside world, and for an hour Shefford fed that appetite, even as he had been done by. But when he had talked himself out, there seemed indication of Presby being more than a good listener. "How'd you come in?" he asked presently. "By Flagstaff, across the Little Colorado, and through Moencopie." "Did you stop at Moen Ave?" "No. What place is that?" "A missionary lives there. Did you stop at Tuba?" "Only long enough to drink and water my horse. That was a wonderful spring for the desert." "You said you were a wanderer. Do you want a job? I'll give you one." "No, thank you, Presby." "I saw your pack. That's no pack to travel with in this country. Your horse won't last, either. Have you any money?" "Yes, plenty of money." "Well, that's good. Not that a white man out here would ever take $1 from you. But you can buy from the Indians as you go. Where are you making for, anyhow?" Shefford hesitated, debating in mind whether to tell his purpose or not. His host did not press the question. "I see. Just foot loose and wandering around," went on Presby. "I can understand how the desert appeals to you. Preachers lead easy, safe, crowded, bound lives. They're shut up in a church with a Bible and good people. When once in a lifetime they get loose, they break out." "Yes, I've broken out beyond all bounds," replied Shefford, sadly. He seemed retrospective for a moment, unaware of the trader's keen and sympathetic glance, and then he caught himself. "I want to see some wild life. Do you know the country north of here?" "Only what the Navajos tell me, and they're not much to talk. There's a trail goes north, but I've never traveled it. It's a new trail every time an Indian goes that way, for here the sand blows and covers old tracks. But few Navajos ride in from the north. My trade is mostly with Indians up and down the valley." "How about water and grass?" We've had rain and snow. There's sure to be water. Can't say about grass, though the sheep and ponies from the north are always fat. But say, Shefford, if you'll excuse me for advising you, don't go north." "Why?" asked Shefford, and it was certain that he thrilled. "It's unknown country, terribly broken, as you can see from here, and there are bad Indians biding in the cañon. I've never met a man who had been over the pass between here and Kayenta. The trip's been made, so there must be a trail. But it's a dangerous trip for any man, let alone a tenderfoot. You're not even packing a gun." "What is this place Kayenta?" asked Shefford. "It's a spring. Kayenta means bottomless spring. There's a little trading post, the last and the wildest in northern Arizona. Withers, the trader who keeps it, hauls his supplies in from Colorado and New Mexico. He's never come down this way. I never saw him, know nothing of him, except hearsay. Reckon he's a nervy and strong man to hold that post. If you want to go there, better go by way of Keams Cañon, and then around the foot of Black Mesa. It'll be a long ride, maybe 200 miles." "How far straight north over the pass?" "Can't say. Upward of 75 miles over rough trails, if there are trails at all. I've heard rumors of a fine tribe of Navajos living in there, rich in sheep and horses. It may be true and it may not. But I do know there are bad Indians, half-breeds and outcasts, hiding in there. Some of them have visited me here. Bad customers. More than that, you'll be going close to the Utah line, and the Mormons over there are unfriendly these days." "Why?" queried Shefford, again with that curious thrill. "They are being persecuted by the government." Shefford asked no more questions, and his host vouchsafed no more information on that score. The conversation lagged. Then Shefford inquired about the Indian girl, and learned that she lived up the valley somewhere. Presby had never seen her before Willetts came with her to Red Lake, and his query brought out the fact that Presby was comparatively new to Red Lake and vicinity. Shefford wondered why a lonely 6 months there had not made the trader old in experience. Probably the desert did not really give up its secrets. Moreover, this Red Lake house was only an occasionally used branch of Presby's main trading post, which was situated at Willow Springs, 50 miles westward over the mesa. "I'm closing up here soon for a spell," said Presby, and now his face lost its set hardness and seemed singularly changed. It was a difference of light and softness. "Won't be so lonesome over at Willow Springs. I'm being married soon." "That's fine," replied Shefford warmly. He was glad for the sake of this lonely desert man. What good a wife would bring into a trader's life. Presby's naive omission, however, appeared to detach him from his present surroundings, and with his massive head enveloped by a cloud of smoke, he lived in dreams. Shefford respected his host's serene abstraction. Indeed, he was grateful for silence. Not for many nights had the past impinged so closely upon the present. The wound in his soul had not healed, and to speak of himself made it bleed anew. Memory was too poignant. The past was too close. He wanted to forget until he had toiled in the heart of this forbidding wilderness, until time had gone by and he dared to face his unquiet soul. Then he listened to the steadily rising roar of the wind. How strange and hollow! The wind was freighted with heavy sand, and he heard it sweep, sweep, sweep by in gusts, and then blow with dull, steady blasts against the walls. The sound was provocative of thought. The moan and rush of wind was no dream. This presence of his in a night enshrouded and sand besieged house of the lonely desert was reality. This adventure was not one of fancy. True indeed, then, must be the wild, strange story that had led him hither. He was going on to seek, to strive, to find. Somewhere northward in the broken fastness lay a hidden valley, walled in from the world. Would they be there, those lost fugitives whose story had thrilled him? After 12 years would she be alive, a child grown to womanhood in the solitude of a beautiful cañon? Incredible! Yet he believed his friend's story, and he indeed knew how strange and tragic life was. He fancied he heard her voice on the sweeping wind. She called to him, haunted him. He admitted the improbability of her existence, but lost nothing of the persistent, intangible hope that drove him. He believed himself a man stricken in soul, unworthy through doubt of God, to minister to the people who had banished him, perhaps a labor of Hercules, a mighty and perilous work of rescue. The saving of this lost and imprisoned girl would help him in his trouble. She might be his salvation. Who could tell? Always as a boy and as a man he had fared forth to find the treasure at the foot of the rainbow. End of chapter 1. Of the Rainbow Trail by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Sagi. Next morning the Indian girl was gone, and the tracks of her pony led north. Shefford's first thought was to wonder if he would overtake her on the trail, and this surprised him with the proof of how unconsciously his resolve to go on had formed. Presby made no further attempt to turn Shefford back, but he insisted on replenishing the pack, and that Shefford take weapons. Finally, Shefford was persuaded to accept a revolver. The trader bade him good by and stood in the door while Shefford led his horse down the slope toward the water hole. Perhaps the trader believed he was watching the departure of a man who would never return. He was still standing at the door of the post when Shefford halted at the pool. Upon the level floor of the valley lay thin patches of snow which had fallen during the night. The air was biting cold, yet stimulated Shefford while it stung him. His horse drank rather slowly and disgustedly. Then Shefford mounted and reluctantly turned his back upon the trading post. As he rode away from the pool he saw a large flock of sheep approaching. They were very closely, even densely packed, in a solid, slow-moving mass, and coming with a precision almost like a march. This fact surprised Shefford, for there was not an Indian in sight. Presently he saw that a dog was leading the flock, and a little later he discovered another dog in the rear of the sheep. They were splendid, long-haired dogs of a wild-looking shepherd breed. He halted his horse to watch the procession pass by. The flock covered fully an acre of ground, and the sheep were black, white, and brown. They passed him, making a little pattering roar on the hard-caked sand. The dogs were taking the sheep into water. Shefford went on and was drawing close to the other side of the basin, where the flat red level was broken by rising dunes and ridges, when he espied a bunch of ponies. A shrill whistle told him that they had seen him. They were wild, shaggy, with long manes and tails. They stopped, threw up their heads, and watched him. Shefford certainly returned the attention. There was no Indian with them. Presently, with a snort, the leader, which appeared to be a stallion, trotted behind the others, seemed to be driving them, and went clear round the band to get in the lead again. He was taking them into water, the same as the dogs had taken the sheep. These incidents were new and pleasing to Shefford. How ignorant he had been of life in the wilderness! Once more he received subtle intimations of what he might learn out in the open, and it was with less weighted heart that he faced the gateway between the huge yellow bluffs on his left and the slow rise of ground to the black mesa on his right. He looked back in time to see the trading post, bleak and lonely on the bare slope, pass out of sight behind the bluffs. Shefford felt no fear. He really had little experience of physical fear, but it was certain that he gritted his teeth and welcomed whatever was to come to him. He had lived a narrow, insulated life with his mind on spiritual things, his family and his congregation and his friends, except that one new friend whose story had enthralled him. Were people of quiet religious habit, the man deep down in him had never had a chance. He breathed hard as he tried to imagine the world opening to him, and almost dared to be glad for the doubt that had sent him adrift. The tracks of the Indian girl's pony were plain in the sand. Also, there were other tracks, not so plain, and these Shefford decided had been made by Willetts and the girl the day before. He climbed a ridge half soft sand and half hard, and saw right before him, rising in striking form, two great yellow buttes like elephant legs. He rode between them, amazed at their height. Then before him stretched a slowly ascending valley, walled on one side by the black mesa and on the other by low bluffs. For miles a dark green growth of greasewood covered the valley, and Shefford could see where the green thinned and failed to give place to sand. He trotted his horse and made good time on this stretch. The day contrasted greatly with any he had yet experienced. Gray clouds obscured the walls of rock a few miles to the west, and Shefford saw squalls of snow like huge veils dropping down and spreading out. The wind cut with the keenness of a knife. Soon he was chilled to the bone. A squall swooped and roared down upon him, and the wind that bore the driving white pellets of snow, almost like hail, was so freezing bitter cold that the former wind seemed warm in comparison. The squall passed as swiftly as it had come, and it left Shefford so benumbed that he could not hold the bridle. He tumbled off his horse and walked. By and by the sun came out and soon warmed him and melted the thin layer of snow on the sand. He was still on the trail of the Indian girl, but hers were now the only tracks he could see. All morning he gradually climbed, with limited view, until at last he mounted to a point where the country lay open to his sight on all sides except where the endless black mesa ranged on into the north. A rugged yellow peak dominated the landscape to the fore, but it was far away. Red and jagged country extended westward to a huge flat-topped wall of gray rock. Lowering swift clouds swept across the sky like drooping mantles and darkened the sun. Shefford built a little fire out of dead greasewood sticks, and with his blanket round his shoulders he hung over the blaze, scorching his clothes and hands. He had been cold before in his life, but he had never before appreciated fire. This desert blast pierced him. The squall enveloped him, thicker and colder and windier than the other. But being better fortified, he did not suffer so much. It howled away, hiding the mesa and leaving a white desert behind. Shefford walked on, leading his horse, until the exercise in the sun had once more warmed him. This last squall had rendered the Indian girl's trail difficult to follow. The snow did not quickly melt, and besides, sheep tracks and the tracks of horses gave him trouble, until at last he was compelled to admit that he could not follow her any longer. A faint path or trail led north, however, and following that, he soon forgot the girl. Every surmounted ridge held a surprise for him. The desert seemed never to change in the vast whole that encompassed him, yet near him it was always changing. From Red Lake he had seen a peaked, walled, and canyoned country, as rough as a stormy sea. But when he rode into that country, the sharp and broken features held to the distance. He was glad to get out of the sand. Long, narrow flats, gray with grass and dotted with patches of greasewood, and lined by low, bare ridges of yellow rock, stretched away from him. leading toward the yellow peak that seemed never to be gained upon. Shefford had pictures in his mind, pictures of stone walls and wild valleys and domed buttes, all of which had been painted in colorful and vivid words by his friend Venters. He believed he would recognize the distinctive and remarkable landmarks Venters had portrayed, and yet he was certain that he had not yet come upon one of them. This was his second lonely day of travel, and he had grown more and more susceptible to the influence of horizon and the different prominent points. He attributed a gradual change in his feelings to the loneliness and the increasing wildness. Between Tuba and Flagstaff he had met Indians and an occasional prospector and teamster. Here he was alone, and though he felt some strange gladness, he could not help but see the difference. He rode on during the gray, lowering, chilly day, and toward evening the clouds broke in the west, and a setting sun shone through the rift, burnishing the desert to red and gold. Shefford's instinctive but deadened love of the beautiful in nature stirred into life, and the moment of its rebirth was a melancholy and sweet one. Too late for the artist's work, but not too late for his soul. For a place to make camp he halted near a low area of rock that lay like an island in a sea of grass. There was an abundance of dead greasewood for a campfire, and after searching over the rock he found little pools of melted snow in the depressions. He took off the saddle and pack, watered his horse, and hobbling him as well as his inexperience permitted, he turned him loose on the grass. Then, while he built a fire and prepared a meal, the night came down upon him. In the lee of the rock he was well sheltered from the wind, but the air was bitter cold. He gathered all the dead greasewood in the vicinity, replenished the fire, and rolled in his blanket back to the blaze. The loneliness and the coyotes did not bother him this night. He was too tired and cold. He went to sleep at once, and did not awaken until the fire died out. Then he rebuilt it and went to sleep again. Every half hour all night long he repeated this, and was glad indeed when the dawn broke. The day began with misfortune. His horse was gone. It had been stolen, or had worked out of sight, or had broken the hobbles and made off. From a high stone ridge Shefford searched the grassy flats and slopes, all to no purpose. Then he tried to track the horse, but this was equally futile. He had expected disasters, and the first one did not daunt him. He tied most of his pack in the blanket, threw the canteen across his shoulder, and set forth, sure at least of one thing, that he was a very much better traveler on foot than on horseback. Walking did not afford him the leisure to study the surrounding country. However, from time to time, when he surmounted a bench, he scanned the different landmarks that had grown familiar. It took hours of steady walking to reach and pass the yellow peak that had been kind of a goal. He saw many sheep trails and horse tracks in the vicinity of this mountain, and once he was sure he espied an Indian watching him from a bold ridge top. The day was bright and warm, with air so clear it magnified objects he knew to be far away. The ascent was gradual. There were many narrow flats connected by steps, and the grass grew thicker and longer. At noon Shefford halted under the first cedar tree, a lonely, dwarfed shrub that seemed to have had a hard life. From this point the rise of ground was more perceptible, and straggling cedars led the eye on to a purple slope that merged into green of pinyon and pine. Could that purple be the sage Venters had so feelingly described, or was it merely the purple of deceiving distance? Whatever it might be, it gave Shefford a thrill and made him think of the strange, shy, and lovely woman Venters had won out here in this purple sage country. He calculated that he had ridden 30 miles the day before and had already traveled 10 miles today. Therefore, could hope to be in the pass before night. Shefford resumed his journey with too much energy and enthusiasm to think of being tired, and he discovered presently that the straggling cedars and the slope beyond were much closer than he had judged them to be. He reached the sage to find it gray instead of purple, yet it was always purple a little way ahead, and if he half shut his eyes it was purple near at hand. He was surprised to find that he could not breathe freely, or it seemed so, and soon made the discovery that the sweet, pungent, penetrating fragrance of sage and cedar had this strange effect upon him. This was an exceedingly dry and odorous forest, where every open space between the clumps of cedars was choked with luxuriant sage. The pinyons were higher up on the mesa, and the pines still higher. Shefford appeared to lose himself. There were no trails. The black mesa on the right and the wall of stone on the left could not be seen. But he pushed on with what was either singular confidence or rash impulse, and he did not know whether that slope was long or short. Once at the summit, he saw with surprise that it broke abruptly and the descent was very steep and short on that side. Through the trees he once more saw the black mesa, rising to the dignity of a mountain, and he had glimpses of another flat narrow valley, this time with a red wall running parallel with the mesa. He could not help but hurry down to get an unobstructed view. His eagerness was rewarded by a splendid scene, yet to his regret he could not force himself to believe it had any relation to the pictured scenes in his mind. The valley was half a mile wide, perhaps several miles long, and it extended in a curve between the cedar-sloped mesa and a looming wall of red stone. There was not a bird or a beast in sight. He found a well-defined trail, but it had not been recently used. He passed a low structure made of peeled logs and mud, with a dark opening like a door. It did not take him many minutes to learn that the valley was longer than he had calculated. He walked swiftly and steadily, in spite of the fact that the pack had become burdensome. What lay beyond the jutting corner of the mesa had increasing fascination for him and acted as a spur. At last he turned the corner, only to be disappointed at sight of another cedar slope. He had a glimpse of a single black shaft of rock rising far in the distance, and it disappeared as his striding forward made the crest of the slope rise toward the sky. Again his view became restricted, and he lost the sense of a slow and gradual uplift of rock and an increase in the scale of proportion. Halfway up this ascent he was compelled to rest, and again the sun was slanting low when he entered the cedar forest. Soon he was descending, and he suddenly came into the open to face a scene that made his heart beat thick and fast. He saw lofty crags and cathedral spires and a wonderful cañon winding between huge, beetling red walls. He heard the murmur of flowing water. The trail led down to the cañon floor, which appeared to be level and green and cut by deep washes in red earth. Could this cañon be the mouth of Deception Pass? It bore no resemblance to any place Shefford had heard described, yet somehow he felt rather than saw that it was the portal to the wild vastness he had traveled so far to enter. Not until he descended the trail and had dropped his pack did he realize how weary and footsore he was. Then he rested, but his eyes roved to and fro, and his mind was active. What a wild and lonesome spot! The low murmur of shallow water came up to him from a deep, narrow cleft. Shadows were already making the cañon seem full of blue haze. He saw a bare slope of stone out of which cedar trees were growing, and as he looked about him he became aware of a singular and very perceptible change in the lights and shades. The sun was setting. The crags were gold-tipped. The shadows crept upward. The sky seemed to darken swiftly. Then the gold changed to red, slowly dulled, and the grays and purples stood out. Shefford was entranced with the beautiful changing effects, and watched till the walls turned black and the sky grew steely and a faint star peeped out. Then he set about the necessary camp tasks. Dead cedars right at hand assured him a comfortable night with a steady fire, and when he had satisfied his hunger he arranged an easy seat before the blazing logs and gave his mind over to thought of his weird, lonely environment. The murmur of running water mingled in harmonious accompaniment with the moan of the wind in the cedars, wild, sweet sounds that were balm to his wounded spirit. They seemed a part of the silence rather than a break in it or a hindrance to the feeling of it. But suddenly that silence did break to the rattle of a rock. Shefford listened, thinking some wild animal was prowling around. He felt no alarm. Presently he heard the sound again and again. Then he recognized the crack of unshod hoofs upon rock. A horse was coming down the trail. Shefford rather resented the interruption, though he still had no alarm. He believed he was perfectly safe. As a matter of fact, he had never in his life been anything but safe and padded around with wool. Hence, never having experienced peril, he did not know what fear was. Presently he saw horse and rider come into the dark prominence on the ridge just above his camp. They were silhouetted against the starry sky. The horseman stopped, and he and his steed made a magnificent black statue, somehow wild and strange in Shefford's sight. Then he came on, vanished in the darkness under the ridge, presently to emerge into the circle of camp fire light. He rode to within 20 feet of Shefford and the fire. The horse was dark, wild-looking, and seemed ready to run. The rider appeared to be an Indian, and yet had something about him suggesting the cowboy. At once Shefford remembered what Presby had said about half-breeds. A little shock, inexplicable to Shefford, rippled over him. He greeted his visitor, but received no answer. Shefford saw a dark, squat figure bending forward in the saddle. The man was tense. All about him was dark, except the glint of a rifle across the saddle. The face under the sombrero was only a shadow. Shefford kicked the fire logs, and a brighter blaze lighted the scene. Then he saw this stranger a little more clearly, and made out an unusually large head, broad, dark face, a sinister, tight-shut mouth, and gleaming black eyes. Those eyes were unmistakably hostile. They roved searchingly over Shefford's pack and then over his person. Shefford felt for the gun that Presby had given him, but it was gone. He had left it back where he had lost his horse and had not thought of it since. Then a strange, slow-coming, cold agitation possessed Shefford. Something gripped his throat. Suddenly Shefford was stricken at a menacing movement on the part of the horseman. He had drawn a gun. Shefford saw it shine darkly in the firelight. The Indian meant to murder him. Shefford saw the grim, dark face in a kind of horrible amaze. He felt the meaning of the drawn weapon as he had never felt anything before in his life, and he collapsed back into his seat with an icy cold, sickening terror. In a second he was dripping wet with cold sweat. Lightning swift thoughts flashed through his mind. It had been one of his platitudes that he was not afraid of death. Yet here he was, a shaking, helpless coward. What had he learned about either life or death? Would this dark savage plunge him into the unknown? It was then that Shefford realized his hollow philosophy and the bitter sweetness of life. He had a brain and a soul, and between them he might have worked out his salvation. But what were they to this ruthless night wanderer, this raw and horrible wildness of the desert? Incapable of voluntary movement, with tongue cleaving to the roof of his mouth, Shefford watched the horseman and the half-poised gun. It was not yet leveled. Then it dawned upon Shefford that the stranger's head was turned a little. his ear to the wind. He was listening. His horse was listening. Suddenly he straightened up, wheeled his horse, and trotted away into the darkness. But he did not climb the ridge down which he had come. Shefford heard the click of hoofs upon the stony trail. Other horses and riders were descending into the cañon. They had been the cause of his deliverance, and in the relaxation of feeling he almost fainted. Then he sat there, slowly recovering, slowly ceasing to tremble, divining that this situation was somehow to change his attitude toward life. 3 horses, 2 with riders, moved in dark shapes across the skyline above the ridge, disappeared as had Shefford's first visitor, and then rode into the light. Shefford saw 2 Indians, a man and a woman, then with surprise recognized the latter to be the Indian girl he had met at Red Lake. He was still more surprised to recognize in the third horse the one he had lost at the last camp. Shefford rose, a little shaky on his legs, to thank these Indians for a double service. The man slipped from his saddle, and his moccasined feet thudded lightly. He was tall, lithe, erect, a singularly graceful figure, and as he advanced, Shefford saw a dark face and sharp, dark eyes. The Indian was bareheaded, with his hair bound in a band. He resembled the girl, but appeared to have a finer face. "How do?" he said in a voice low and distinct. He extended his hand, and Shefford felt a grip of steel. He returned the greeting. Then the Indian gave Shefford the bridle of the horse, and made signs that appeared to indicate the horse had broken his hobbles and strayed. Shefford thanked him. Thereupon the Indian unsaddled and led the horses away, evidently to water them. The girl remained behind. Shefford addressed her, but she was shy and did not respond. He then set about cooking a meal for his visitors, and was busily engaged at this when the Indian returned without the horses. Presently Shefford resumed his seat by the fire and watched the 2 eat what he had prepared. They certainly were hungry, and soon had the pans and cups empty. The girl drew back a little into the shadow while the man sat with his legs crossed and his feet tucked under him. His dark face was smooth, yet it seemed to have lines under the surface. Shefford was impressed. He had never seen an Indian who interested him as this one. Looked at superficially, he appeared young, wild, silent, locked in his primeval apathy, just a healthy savage, but looked at more attentively, he appeared matured, even old, a strange, sad, brooding figure with a burden on his shoulders. Shefford found himself growing curious. "What place?" asked Shefford, waving his hand toward the dark opening between the black cliffs. "Sagi," replied the Indian. That did not mean anything to Shefford, and he asked if the Sagi was the pass, but the Indian shook his head. "Wife?" asked Shefford, pointing to the girl. The Indian shook his head again. "Bai La," he said. "What you mean?" asked Shefford. "What Bai La?" "Sister," replied the Indian. He spoke the word reluctantly, as if the white man's language did not please him, but the clearness and correct pronunciation surprised Shefford. "What name? What call her?" he went on. "Glen Naspa." "What your name?" inquired Shefford, indicating the Indian. "Nasaba Bega," answered the Indian. "Navajo?" The Indian bowed with what seemed pride and stately dignity. "My name John Shefford. Come far way back toward rising sun. Come stay here long." Nas Ta Bega's dark eyes were fixed steadily upon Shefford. He reflected that he could not remember having felt so penetrating a gaze, but neither the Indian's eyes nor face gave any clue to his thoughts. "Navajo no savvy Jesus Christ," said the Indian, and his voice rolled out low and deep. Shefford felt both amaze and pain. The Indian had taken him for a missionary. "No, me no missionary," cried Shefford. and he flung up a passionately repudiating hand. A singular flash shot from the Indian's dark eyes. It struck Shefford even at this stinging moment when the past came back. "Trade, buy wool, blanket?" queried Nas Ta Bega. "No," replied Shefford. "Me want ride, walk far." He waved his hand to indicate a wide sweep of territory. "Me sick." Nas Ta Bega laid a significant finger upon his lungs. "No," replied Shefford. "Me strong, sick here," and with motions of his hands he tried to show that his was a trouble of the heart. Shefford received instant impression of this Indian's intelligent comprehension, but he could not tell just what had given him the feeling. Nas Ta Bega rose then and walked away into the shadow. Shefford heard him working around the dead cedar tree, where he had probably gone to get firewood. Then Shefford heard a splintering crash, which was followed by a crunching, bumping sound. Presently he was astounded to see the Indian enter the lighted circle, dragging the whole cedar tree, trunk first. Shefford would have doubted the ability of two men to drag that tree, and here came Nas Ta Bega managing it easily. He laid the trunk on the fire and then proceeded to break off small branches, to place them advantageously where the red coals kindled them into a blaze. The Indian's next move was to place his saddle, which he evidently meant to use for a pillow. Then he spread a goatskin on the ground, lay down upon it with his back to the fire, and pulling a long-haired saddle blanket over his shoulders, he relaxed and became motionless. His sister, Glen Naspa, did likewise, except that she stayed farther away from the fire, and she had a larger blanket, which covered her well. It appeared to Shefford that they went to sleep at once. Shefford felt as tired as he had ever been, but he did not think he could soon drop into slumber, and in fact he did not want to. There was something in the companionship of these Indians that he had not experienced before. He still had a strange and weak feeling, the aftermath of that fear which had sickened him with its horrible icy grip. Nas Ta Bega's arrival had frightened away that dark and silent prowler of the night, and Shefford was convinced the Indian had saved his life. The measure of his gratitude was a source of wonder to him. Had he cared so much for life? Yes, he had, when face to face with death. That was something to know. It helped him, and he gathered from his strange feeling that the romantic quest which had brought him into the wilderness might turn out to be an antidote for the morbid bitterness of heart. With new sensations had come new thoughts. Right then it was very pleasant to sit in the warmth and light of the roaring cedar fire. There was a deep-seated ache of fatigue in his bones. What joy it was to rest! He had felt the dry scorch of desert thirst and the pang of hunger. How wonderful to learn the real meaning of water and food! He had just finished the longest, hardest day's work of his life. Had that anything to do with a something almost like peace which seemed to hover near in the shadows, trying to come to him? He had befriended an Indian girl, and now her brother had paid back the service. Both the giving and receiving were somehow sweet to Shefford. They opened up hitherto vague channels of thought. For years he had imagined he was serving people when he had never lifted a hand. A blow given in the defense of an Indian girl had somehow operated to make a change in John Shefford's existence. It had liberated a spirit in him. Moreover, it had worked its influence outside his mind. The Indian girl and her brother had followed his trail to return his horse, perhaps to guide him safely, but unknowingly, perhaps, they had done infinitely more than that for him. As Shefford's eyes wandered over the dark, still figures of the sleepers, he had a strange, dreamy premonition, or perhaps only a fancy, that there was to be more come of this fortunate meeting. For the rest, it was good to be there in the speaking silence, to feel the heat on his outstretched palms and the cold wind on his cheek, to see the black wall lifting its bold outline and the crags reaching for the white stars. End of chapter 2. Three of the Rainbow Trail by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Kayenta. The stamping of horses awoke Shefford. He saw a towering crag, rosy in the morning light, like a huge red spear splitting the clear blue of sky. He got up, feeling cramped and sore, yet with unfamiliar exhilaration. The whipping air made him stretch his hands to the fire. An odor of coffee and broiled meat mingled with the fragrance of wood smoke. Glen Nasaba was on her knees broiling a rabbit on a stick over the red coals. Nasaba Bega was saddling the ponies. The cañon appeared to be full of purple shadows, under one side of dark cliffs and golden streaks of mist on the other where the sun struck high up on the walls. "Good morning," said Shefford. Glen Nasaba shyly replied in Navajo. "How?" was Nas Ta Bega's greeting. In daylight the Indian lost some of the dark somberness of face that had impressed Shefford. He had a noble head, in poise like that of an eagle, a bold, clean-cut profile, and stern, close-shut lips. His eyes were the most striking and attractive feature about him. They were coal-black and piercing. The intent look of them seemed to come from a keen and inquisitive mind. Shefford ate breakfast with the Indians, and then he helped with the few preparations for departure. Before they mounted, Nas Ta Bega pointed to horse tracks in the dust. They were those that had been made by Shefford's threatening visitor of the night before. Shefford explained by word and sign, and succeeded at least in showing that he had been in danger. Nas Ta Bega followed the tracks a little way and presently returned. "Shadd," he said, with an ominous shake of his head. Shefford did not understand whether he meant the name of his visitor or something else, but the menace connected with the word was clear enough. Glen Nasaba mounted her pony, and it was a graceful action that pleased Shefford. He climbed a little stiffly into his own saddle. Then Nas Ta Bega got up and pointed northward. "Kayenta?" he inquired. Shefford nodded, and then they were off, with Glen Nasaba in the lead. They did not climb the trail which they had descended, but took one leading to the right along the base of the slope. Shefford saw down into the red wash that bisected the cañon floor. It was a sheer wall of red clay or loam, 100 feet high, and at the bottom ran a swift, shallow stream of reddish water. Then for a time a high growth of greasewood hid the surroundings from Shefford's sight. Presently the trail led out into the open, and Shefford saw that he was at the neck of a wonderful valley that gradually widened with great jagged red peaks on the left and the black mesa, now a mountain, running away to the right. He turned to find that the opening of the Sagi could no longer be seen, and he was conscious of a strong desire to return and explore that cañon. Soon Glen Nasaba put her pony to a long, easy, swinging canter, and her followers did likewise. As they got outward into the valley, Shefford lost the sense of being overshadowed and crowded by the nearness of the huge walls and crags. The trail appeared level underfoot, but at a distance it was seen to climb. Shefford found where it disappeared over the foot of a slope that formed a graceful rising line up to the cedared flank of the mesa. The valley floor, widening away to the north, remained level and green. Beyond rose the jagged range of red peaks, all strangely cut and slanting. These distant, deceiving features of the country held Shefford's gaze until the Indian drew his attention to things near at hand. Then Shefford saw flocks of sheep dotting the gray-green valley. and bands of beautiful, long-maned, long-tailed ponies. For several miles the scene did not change, except that Shefford imagined he came to see where the upland plain ended or at least broke its level. He was right, for presently the Indian pointed, and Shefford went on to halt upon the edge of a steep slope leading down into a valley vast in its barren gray reaches. "Kayenta," said Nas Ta Bega. Shefford at first saw nothing except the monotonous gray valley, reaching far to the strange, grotesque monuments of yellow cliff. Then close under the foot of the slope he espied two squat stone houses with red roofs, and a corral with a pool of water shining in the sun. The trail leading down was steep and sandy, but it was not long. Shefford's sweeping eyes appeared to take in everything at once: the crude stone structures with their earthen roofs, the piles of dirty wool, the Indians lolling around, the tents and wagons and horses, little lazy burros and dogs, and scattered everywhere saddles, blankets, guns, and packs. Then a white man came out of the door. He waved a hand and shouted. Dust and wool and flour were thick upon him. He was muscular and weather-beaten, and appeared young in activity rather than face. A gun swung at his hip, and a row of brass-tipped cartridges showed in his belt. Shefford looked into a face that he thought he had seen before, until he realized the similarity was only the bronze and hard line and rugged cast common to desert men. The gray, searching eyes went right through him. "Glad to see you. Get down and come in. Just heard from an Indian that you were coming. I'm the trader, Withers," he said to Shefford. His voice was welcoming, and the grip of his hand made Shefford's ache. Shefford told his name and said he was as glad as he was lucky to arrive at Kayenta. "Hello, Nas Ta Bega!" exclaimed Withers. His tone expressed a surprise his face did not show. "Did this Indian bring you in?" Withers shook hands with the Navajo, while Shefford briefly related what he owed to him. Then Withers looked at Nas Ta Bega and spoke to him in the Indian tongue. "Shad," said Nas Ta Bega. Withers let out a dry little laugh, and his strong hand tugged at his mustache. "Who's Shad?" asked Shefford. "He's a half-breed Ute, bad Indian, outlaw, murderer. He's in with a gang of outlaws who hide in the San Juan country. Reckon you're lucky. How'd you come to be there in the Sagi alone?" "I traveled from Red Lake. Presby, the trader there, advised me against it, but I came anyway." "Well," Withers' gray glance was kind, if it did express the foolhardiness of Shefford's act. "Come into the house. Never mind the horse. My wife will sure be glad to see you." Withers led Shefford by the first stone house, which evidently was the trading store, into the second. The room Shefford entered was large, with logs smoldering in a huge open fireplace, blankets covering every foot of floor space, and Indian baskets and silver ornaments everywhere, and strange Indian designs painted upon the whitewashed walls. Withers called his wife and made her acquainted with Shefford. She was a slight, comely little woman with keen, earnest, dark eyes. She seemed to be serious and quiet, but she made Shefford feel at home immediately. He refused, however, to accept the room offered him, saying that he meant to sleep out under the open sky. Withers laughed at this and said he understood. Shefford, remembering Presby's hunger for news of the outside world, told this trader and his wife all he could think of, and he was listened to with that close attention a traveler always gained in the remote places. "Sure am glad you rode in," said Withers for the fourth time. "Now you make yourself at home. Stay here. Come over to the store. Do what you like. I've got to work. Tonight we'll talk." Shefford went out with his host. The store was as interesting as Presby's, though much smaller and more primitive. It was full of everything, and smelled strongly of sheep and goats. There was a narrow aisle between sacks of flour and blankets on one side and a high counter on the other. Behind this counter Withers stood to wait upon the buying Indians. They sold blankets and skins and bags of wool, and in exchange took silver money. Then they lingered with slow, staid reluctance, bought one thing and then another: flour, sugar, canned goods, coffee, tobacco, ammunition. The counter was never without 2 or 3 Indians leaning on their dark, silver-braceleted arms. But as they were slow to sell and buy and go, so were others slow to come in. Their voices were soft and low, and it seemed to Shefford they were whispering. He liked to hear them and look at the banded heads, the long, twisted rolls of black hair tied with white cords, the still dark faces and watchful eyes, the silver earrings, the slender, shapely brown hands, the lean and sinewy shapes, the corduroys with a belt and gun, and the small, close-fitting buckskin moccasins buttoned with coins. These Indians all appeared young, and under the quiet, slow demeanor there was fierce blood and fire. By and by 2 women came in, evidently squaw and daughter. The former was a huge, stout Indian with a face that was certainly pleasant if not jolly. She had the corners of a blanket tied under her chin, and in the folds behind on her broad back was a naked Indian baby, round and black of head, brown-skinned, with eyes as bright as beads. When the youngster caught sight of Shefford, he made a startled dive into the sack of the blanket. Manifestly, however, curiosity got the better of fear, for presently Shefford caught a pair of wondering dark eyes peeping at him. "They're good spenders, but slow," said Withers. "The Navajos are careful and cautious. That's why they're rich. This squaw, Yan Aspa, has flocks of sheep and more mustangs than she knows about." "Mustangs? So that's what you call the ponies," replied Shefford. "Yep, they're mustangs, and mostly wild as jackrabbits." Shefford strolled outside and made the acquaintance of Withers's helper, a Mormon named Wistner. He was a stockily built man past maturity, and his sun-blistered face and watery eyes told of the open desert. He was engaged in weighing sacks of wool brought in by the Indians. Near by stood a framework of poles from which an immense bag was suspended. From the top of this bag protruded the head and shoulders of an Indian who appeared to be stamping and packing wool with his feet. He grinned at the curious Shefford, but Shefford was more interested in the Mormon. So far as he knew, Wistner was the first man of that creed he had ever met, and he could scarcely hide his eagerness. Ventnor's stories had been of a long past generation of Mormons, fanatical, ruthless, and unchangeable. Shefford did not expect to meet Mormons of this kind, but any man of that religion would have interested him. Besides this, Wistner seemed to bring him closer to that wild secret cañon he had come west to find. Shefford was somewhat amazed and discomfited to have his polite and friendly overtures repulsed. Wistner might have been an Indian. He was cold, incommunicative, aloof, and there was something about him that made the sensitive Shefford feel his presence was resented. Presently Shefford strolled on to the corral, which was full of shaggy mustangs. They snorted and kicked at him. He had a half-formed wish that he would never be called upon to ride one of those wild brutes, and then he found himself thinking that he would ride one of them, and after a while any of them. Shefford did not understand himself, but he fought his natural instinctive reluctance to meet obstacles, peril, suffering. He traced the white-bordered little stream that made the pool in the corral, and when he came to where it oozed out of the sand under the bluff, he decided that was not the spring which had made Kayenta famous. Presently, down below the trading post, he saw a trough from which burros were drinking. Here he found the spring, a deep well of eddying water, walled in by stones, and the overflow made a shallow stream meandering away between its borders of alkali like a crust of salt. Shefford tasted the water. It bit, but it was good. Shefford had no trouble in making friends with the lazy, sleepy-eyed burros. They let him pull their long ears and rub their noses, but the mustangs standing around were unapproachable. They had wild eyes, they raised long ears and looked vicious. He let them alone. Evidently this trading post was a great deal busier than Red Lake. Shefford counted a dozen Indians lounging outside, and there were others riding away. Big wagons told how the bags of wool were transported out of the wilds and how supplies were brought in. A wide, hard-packed road led off to the east, and another, not so clearly defined, wound away to the north, and Indian trails streaked off in all directions. Shefford discovered, however, when he had walked off a mile or so across the valley to lose sight of the post, that the feeling of wildness and loneliness returned to him. It was a wonderful country. It held something for him beside the possible rescue of an imprisoned girl from a wild cañon. That night after supper, when Withers and Shefford sat alone before the blazing logs in the huge fireplace, the trader laid his hand on Shefford's and said with directness and force: "I've lived my life in the desert. I've met many men and have been a friend to most. You're no prospector or trader or missionary." "No," replied Shefford. "You've had trouble?" "Yes." "Have you come in here to hide? Don't be afraid to tell me. I won't give you away." "I didn't come to hide." "Then no one is after you? You've done no wrong?" "Perhaps I've wronged myself, but no one else," replied Shefford steadily. "I reckon so. Well, tell me or keep your secret. It's all one to me." Shefford felt a desire to unburden himself. This man was strong, persuasive, kindly. He drew Shefford. "You're welcome in Kayenta," went on Withers. "Stay as long as you like. I take no pay from a white man. If you want work, I have it aplenty." "Thank you. That is good. I need to work. We'll talk of it later. But just yet I can't tell you why I came to Kayenta, what I want to do, and how long I shall stay. My thoughts put in words would seem so like dreams. Maybe they are dreams. Perhaps I'm only chasing a phantom. Perhaps I'm only hunting the treasure at the foot of the rainbow." "Well, this is the country for rainbows," laughed Withers. "In summer, from June to August, when it storms, we have rainbows that'll make you think you're in another world. The Navajos have rainbow mountains, rainbow canyons, rainbow bridges of stone, rainbow trails. It sure is a rainbow country." That deep and mystic chord in Shefford thrilled. Here it was again, something tangible at the bottom of his dream. Withers did not wait for Shefford to say any more, and almost as if he read his visitor's mind, he began to talk about the wild country he called home. He had lived at Kayenta for several years, hard and profitless years by reason of marauding outlaws. He could not have lived there at all but for the protection of the Indians. His father-in-law had been friendly with the Navajos and Piutes for many years, and his wife had been brought up among them. She was held in particular reverence and affection by both tribes in that part of the country. Probably she knew more of the Indians' habits, religions, and life than any white person in the West. Both tribes were friendly and peaceable, but there were bad Indians, half-breeds, and outlaws that made the trading post a venture Withers had long considered precarious, and he wanted to move and intended to some day. His nearest neighbors in New Mexico and Colorado were 100 miles distant, and at some seasons the roads were impassable. To the north, however, 20 miles or so, was situated a Mormon village named Stonebridge. It lay across the Utah line. Withers did some business with this village, but scarcely enough to warrant the risks he had to run. During the last year he had lost several pack trains, one of which he had never heard of after it left Stonebridge. "Stonebridge!" exclaimed Shefford, and he trembled. He had heard that name. In his memory it had a place beside the name of another village Shefford longed to speak of to this trader. "Yes, Stonebridge," replied Withers. "Ever heard the name?" "I think so. Are there other villages in that part of the country?" "A few, but not close. Glaze is now only a water hole. Bluff and Monticello are far north across the San Juan. There used to be another village, but that wouldn't interest you." "Maybe it would," replied Shefford quietly. But his hint was not taken by the trader. Withers suddenly showed a semblance of the aloofness Shefford had observed in Wistner. "Withers, pardon an impertinence. I am deeply serious. Are you a Mormon?" "Indeed I'm not," replied the trader instantly. "Are you for the Mormons or against them?" "Neither. I get along with them. I know them. I believe they are a misunderstood people." "That's for them. No, I'm only fair minded." Shefford paused, trying to curb his thrilling impulse, but it was too strong. "You said there used to be another village. Was the name of it Cottonwoods?" Withers gave a start and faced round to stare at Shefford in blank astonishment. "Say, did you give me a straight story about yourself?" he queried sharply. "So far as I went," replied Shefford. "You're no spy on the lookout for sealed wives?" "Absolutely not. I do not even know what you mean by sealed wives." "Well, it's damned strange that you'd know the name Cottonwoods. Yes, that's the name of the village I meant, the one that used to be. It's gone now, all except a few stone walls." "What became of it?" "Torn down by the Mormons years ago. They destroyed it and moved away. I've heard Indians talk about a grand spring that was there once. It's gone, too. Its name was let me see." "Amber Spring?" interrupted Shefford. "By George, you're right," rejoined the trader, again amazed. "Shefford, this beats me. I haven't heard that name for 10 years. I can't help seeing what a tenderfoot stranger you are to the desert. Yet here you are, speaking of what you should know nothing of. And there's more behind this." Shefford rose, unable to conceal his agitation. "Did you ever hear of a rider named Venters?" "Rider? You mean a cowboy? Venters? No, I never heard that name." "Did you ever hear of a gunman named Lassiter?" queried Shefford with increasing emotion. "No." "Did you ever hear of a Mormon woman named Jane Withersteen?" "No." Shefford drew his breath sharply. He had followed a gleam. He had caught a fleeting glimpse of it. "Did you ever hear of a child, a girl, a woman called Fay Larkin?" Withers rose slowly with a paling face. "If you're a spy it'll go hard with you, though I'm no Mormon," he said, grimly. Shefford lifted a shaking hand. "I was a clergyman. Now I'm nothing, a wanderer, least of all a spy." Withers leaned close to see into the other man's eyes. He looked long and then appeared satisfied. "I've heard the name Fay Larkin," he said, slowly. "I reckon that's all I'll say till you tell your story." Shefford stood with his back to the fire, and he turned the palms of his hands to catch the warmth. He felt cold. Withers had affected him strangely. What was the meaning of the trader's somber gravity? Why was the very mention of Mormons attended by something austere and secret? "My name is John Shefford. I'm 24," began Shefford. "My family " Here a knock on the door interrupted Shefford. "Come in," called Withers. The door opened, and like a shadow Nas Ta Bega slipped in. He said something in Navajo to the trader. "How," he said to Shefford, and extended his hand. He was stately, but there was no mistaking his friendliness. Then he sat down before the fire, doubled his legs under him after the Indian fashion, and with dark eyes on the blazing logs seemed to lose himself in meditation. "He likes the fire!" exclaimed Withers. Whenever he comes to Kayenta, he always visits me like this. Don't mind him. Go on with your story." "My family were plain people, well-to-do and very religious," went on Shefford. "When I was a boy we moved from the country to a town called Beaumont, Illinois. There was a college in Beaumont, and eventually I was sent to it to study for the ministry. I wanted to be but never mind that. By the time I was 22 I was ready for my career as a clergyman. I preached for a year around at different places, and then got a church in my hometown of Beaumont. I became exceedingly good friends with a man named Venters, who had recently come to Beaumont. He was a singular man. His wife was a strange, beautiful woman, very reserved, and she had wonderful dark eyes. They had money and were devoted to each other and perfectly happy. They owned the finest horses ever seen in Illinois, and their particular enjoyment seemed to be riding. They were always taking long rides. It was something worth going far to see Mrs. Venters on a horse. It was through my own love of horses that I became friendly with Venters. He and his wife attended my church, and as I got to see more of them, gradually we grew intimate. And it was not until I did get intimate with them that I realized that both seemed to be haunted by the past. They were sometimes sad, even in their happiness. They drifted off into dreams. They lived back in another world. They seemed to be listening. Indeed, they were a singularly interesting couple, and I grew genuinely fond of them. By and by they had a little girl, whom they named Jane. The coming of the baby made a change in my friends. They were happier, and I observed that the haunting shadow did not so often return. Venters had spoken of a journey west that he and his wife meant to take some time, but after the baby came he never mentioned his wife in connection with the trip. I gathered that he felt compelled to go to clear up a mystery or to find something. I did not make out just what. But eventually, and it was about a year ago, he told me his story, the strangest, wildest, and most tragic I ever heard. I can't tell it all now. It's enough to say that 15 years before he had been a rider for a rich Mormon woman named Jane Withersteen, of this village, Cottonwoods. She had adopted a beautiful Gentile child named Fay Larkin. Her interest in Gentiles earned the displeasure of her churchmen, and as she was proud, there came a breach. Venters and a gunman named Lassiter became involved in her quarrel. Finally, Venters took to the cañon. Here in the wilds he found the strange girl he eventually married. For a long time they lived in a wonderful hidden valley, the entrance to which was guarded by a huge balancing rock. Venters got away with the girl, but Lassiter and Jane Withersteen and the child Fay Larkin were driven into the cañon. They escaped to the valley where Venters had lived. Lassiter rolled the balancing rock, and crashing down the narrow trail, it loosened the weathered walls and closed the narrow outlet forever. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4, Part 1 of The Rainbow Trail by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. New Friends, Part 1. Shefford ended his narrative out of breath, pale, and dripping with sweat. Withers sat leaning forward with an expression of intense interest. Nasaba Bega's easy, graceful pose had succeeded to one of strained rigidity. He seemed a statue of bronze. Could a few intelligible words, Shefford wondered, have created that strange, listening posture? "Venters got out of Utah, of course, as you know," went on Shefford. "He got out knowing, as I feel I would have known, that Jane, Lassiter, and little Fay Larkin were shut up, walled up in Surprise Valley. For years Venters considered it would not have been safe for him to venture to rescue them. He had no fears for their lives. They could live in Surprise Valley, but Venters always intended to come back with Bess, and find the valley and his friends. No wonder he and Bess were haunted. However, when his wife had the baby, that made a difference. It meant he had to go alone, and he was thinking seriously of starting when there were developments that made it desirable for me to leave Beaumont. Venters's story haunted me as he had been haunted. I dreamed of that wild valley, of little Fay Larkin grown to womanhood, such a woman as Bess Venters was, and the longing to come was great. And Withers, here I am." The trader reached out and gave Shefford the grip of a man in whom emotion was powerful, but deep and difficult to express. "Listen to this. I wish I could help you. Life is a queer deal. Shefford, I've got to trust you. Over here in the wild cañon country there's a village of Mormons' sealed wives. It's in Arizona, perhaps 20 miles from here, and near the Utah line. When the United States government began to persecute or prosecute the Mormons for polygamy, the Mormons over here in Stonebridge took their sealed wives and moved them out of Utah, just across the line. They built houses, established a village there. I'm the only Gentile who knows about it, and I pack supplies every few weeks into these women. There are perhaps 50 women, mostly young, second or third or fourth wives of Mormons, sealed wives. And I want you to understand that sealed means sealed in all that religion or loyalty can get out of the word. There are also some old women and old men in the village, but they hardly count. And there's a flock of the finest children you ever saw in your life. The idea of the Mormons must have been to escape prosecution. The law of the government is one wife for each man, no more. All over Utah polygamists have been arrested. The Mormons are deeply concerned. I believe they are good, law-abiding people, but this law is a direct blow at their religion. In my opinion, they can't obey both, and therefore they have not altogether given up plural wives. Perhaps they will some day. I have no proof, but I believe the Mormons at Stonebridge pay secret night visits to their sealed wives across the line in the lonely, hidden village. Now once over in Stonebridge I overheard some Mormons talking about a girl who was named Fay Larkin. I never forgot the name. Later I heard the name in this sealed wife village. But as I told you, I never heard of Lassiter or Jane Withersteen. Still, if Mormons had found them, I would never have heard of it. And Deception Pass, that might be the Sagi. I'm not surprised at your rainbow-chasing adventure. It's a great story. This Fay Larkin I've heard of might be your Fay Larkin. I almost believe so. Shefford, I'll help you find out. Yes, yes, I must know, replied Shefford. Oh, I hope, I pray we can find her. But I'd rather she was dead if she's not still hidden in the valley. Naturally, you've dreamed yourself into rescuing this lost Fay Larkin. But, Shefford, you're old enough to know life doesn't work out as you want it to. One way or another, I fear you are in for a bitter disappointment. Withers, take me to the village. Shefford, you're liable to get in bad out there, said the trader gravely. I couldn't be any more ruined than I am now, replied Shefford passionately. But there's risk in this, risk such as you've never had, persisted Withers. I'll risk anything. Reckon this is a funny deal for a sheep trader to have on his hands, continued Withers. Shefford, I like you. I've a mind to see you through this. It's a damn strange story. I'll tell you what, I will help you. I'll give you a job packing supplies into the village. I meant to turn that over to a Mormon cowboy, Joe Lake. The job shall be yours, and I'll go with you first trip. Here's my hand on it. Now, Shefford, I'm more curious about you than I was before you told your story. What ruined you? As we're to be partners, you can tell me now. I'll keep your secret. Maybe I can do you good. Shefford wanted to confess, yet it was hard. Perhaps, had he not been so agitated, he would not have answered to impulse. But this trader was a man of the desert. He would understand. "I told you I was a clergyman," said Shefford in a low voice. "I didn't want to be one, but they made me one. I did my best. I failed. I had doubts of religion, of the Bible, of God, as my church believed in them. As I grew older, thought and study convinced me of the narrowness of my religion as my congregation lived it. I preached what I believed. I alienated them. They put me out, took my calling from me, disgraced me, ruined me." "So that's all?" exclaimed Withers slowly. "You didn't believe in the God of the Bible? Well, I've been in the desert long enough to know that there is a God, but probably not the one your church worships. Shefford, go to the Navajo for a faith." Shefford had forgotten the presence of Nas Ta Bega, and perhaps Withers had likewise. At this juncture the Indian rose to his full height, and he folded his arms to stand with the somber pride of a chieftain while his dark, inscrutable eyes were riveted upon Shefford. At that moment he seemed magnificent. How infinitely more he seemed than just a common Indian who had chanced to befriend a white man. The difference was obscure to Shefford, but he felt that it was there in the Navajo's mind. Nas Ta Bega's strange look was not to be interpreted. Finally he turned and passed from the room. "By George!" cried Withers suddenly, and he pounded his knee with his fist. "I'd forgotten." "What?" ejaculated Shefford. "Why, that Indian understood every word we said. He knows English. He's educated. Well, if this doesn't beat me. Let me tell you about Nas Ta Bega." Withers seemed to be recalling something half forgotten. "Years ago, in '57, I think, Kit Carson with his soldiers chased the Navajo tribes and rounded them up to be put on reservations. But he failed to catch all the members of one tribe. They escaped up into a wild cañon like the Sagi. The descendants of these fugitives live there now and are the finest Indians on earth, the finest because unspoiled by the white man. Well, as I got the story, years after Carson's roundup, one of his soldiers guided some interested travelers in here. When they left, they took an Indian boy with them to educate. From what I know of Navajos, I'm inclined to think the boy was taken against his parents' wish. Anyway, he was taken. That boy was Nas Ta Bega. The story goes that he was educated somewhere. Years afterwards, and perhaps not long before I came in here, he returned to his people. There have been missionaries and other interested fools who have given Indians a white man's education. In all the instances I know of, these educated Indians returned to their tribes, repudiating the white man's knowledge, habits, life, and religion. I have heard that Nas Ta Bega came back, laid down the white man's clothes along with the education, and never again showed that he had known either. You have just seen how strangely he acted. It's almost certain he heard our conversation. Well, it doesn't matter. He won't tell. He can hardly be made to use an English word. Besides, he's a noble red man, if there ever was one. He has been a friend in need to me. If you stay long out here, you'll learn something from the Indians. Nas Ta Bega has befriended you, too, it seems. I thought he showed unusual interest in you. Perhaps that was because I saved his sister, well, to be charitable, from the rather rude advances of a white man," said Shefford, and he proceeded to tell of the incident that occurred at Red Lake. "Willetts!" exclaimed Withers, with much the same expression that Presby had used. "I never met him, but I know about him. Well, the Indians don't like him much. Most of the missionaries are good men. Good for the Indians, in a way, but sometimes one drifts out here who is bad. A bad missionary teaching religion to savages. Queer, isn't it? The queerest part is the white people's blindness, the blindness of those who send the missionaries. Well, I dare say Willetts isn't very good. When Presby said that was Willetts' way of teaching religion, he meant just what he said. If Willetts drifts over here, he'll be risking much. This, you told me, explains Nas Ta Bega's friendliness toward you, and also his bringing his sister Glen Naspa to live with relatives up in the pass. She had been living near Red Lake. Do you mean Nas Ta Bega wants to keep his sister far removed from Willetts?" inquired Shefford. "I mean that," replied Withers, "and I hope he's not too late." Later, Shefford went outdoors to walk and think. There was no moon, but the stars made light enough to cast his shadow on the ground. The dark, illimitable expanse of blue sky seemed to be glittering with numberless points of fire. The air was cold and still. A dreaming silence lay over the land. Shefford saw and felt all these things, and their effect was continuous and remained with him and helped calm him. He was conscious of a burden removed from his mind. Confession of his secret had been like tearing a thorn from his flesh, but once done, it afforded him relief and a singular realization that out here it did not matter much. In a crowd of men all looking at him and judging him by their standards, he had been made to suffer. Here, if he were judged at all, it would be by what he could do, how he sustained himself and helped others. He walked far across the valley toward the low bluffs, but they did not seem to get any closer, and finally he stopped beside a stone and looked around at the strange horizon and up at the heavens. He did not feel utterly aloof from them, nor alone in a waste, nor a useless atom amid incomprehensible forces. Something like a loosened mantle fell from about him, dropping at his feet, and all at once he was conscious of freedom. He did not understand in the least why abasement left him, but it was so. He had come a long way, in bitterness, in despair, believing himself to be what men had called him. The desert and the stars and the wind, the silence of the night, the loneliness of this vast country where there was room for 1,000 cities, these somehow vaguely yet surely bade him lift his head. They withheld their secret, but they made a promise. The thing which he had been feeling every day and every night was a strange, enveloping comfort. And it was at this moment that Shefford, divining whence his help was to come, embraced all that wild and speaking nature around and above him, and surrendered himself utterly. "I am young. I am free. I have my life to live," he said. "I'll be a man. I'll take what comes. Let me learn here." When he had spoken out, settled once and forever his attitude toward his future, he seemed to be born again, wonderfully alive to the influences around him, ready to trust what yet remained a mystery. Then his thoughts reverted to Fay Larkin. Could this girl be known to the Mormons? It was possible. Fay Larkin was an unusual name. Deep into Shefford's heart had sunk the story Venters had told. Shefford found that he had unconsciously created a like romance. He had been loving a wild and strange and lonely girl, like beautiful Bess Venters. It was a shock to learn the truth, but as it had been only a dream, it could hardly be vital. Shefford retraced his steps toward the post. Halfway back he espied a tall, dark figure moving toward him, and presently the shape and the step seemed familiar. Then he recognized Nas Ta Bega. Soon they were face to face. Shefford felt that the Indian had been trailing him over the sand, and this was to be a significant meeting. Remembering Winter's revelation about the Navajo, Shefford scarcely knew how to approach him now. There was no difference to be made out in Nas Ta Bega's dark face and inscrutable eyes. Yet there was a difference to be felt in his presence. But the Indian did not speak, and turned to walk by Shefford's side. Shefford could not long be silent. "Nas Ta Bega, were you looking for me?" he asked. "You had no gun," replied the Indian. But for his very low voice, his slow speaking of the words, Shefford would have thought him a white man. For Shefford there was indeed an instinct in this meeting, and he turned to face the Navajo. Withers told me you had been educated, that you came back to the desert, that you never showed your training. Nas Ta Bega, did you understand all I told Withers?" "Yes," replied the Indian. "You won't betray me?" "I am a Navajo." "Nas Ta Bega, you trail me. You say I had no gun." Shefford wanted to ask this Indian if he cared to be the white man's friend, but the question was not easy to put, and besides seemed unnecessary. "I am alone and strange in this wild country. I must learn." "Nas Ta Bega will show you the trails and the water holes and how to hide from Shadd." "For money, for silver, you will do this?" inquired Shefford. Shefford felt that the Indian's silence was a rebuke. He remembered Withers's singular praise of this red man. He realized he must change his idea of Indians. "Nas Ta Bega, I know nothing. I feel like a child in the wilderness. When I speak it is out of the mouth of those who have taught me. I must find a new voice and a new life. You heard my story to Withers. I am an outcast from my own people. If you will be my friend, be so." The Indian clasped Shefford's hand and held it in a response that was more beautiful for its silence. So they stood for a moment in the starlight. "Nas Ta Bega, what did Withers mean when he said go to the Navajo for a faith?" asked Shefford. "He meant the desert is my mother. Will you go with Nas Ta Bega into the cañon and the mountains?" "Indeed I will." They unclasped hands and turned toward the trading post. "Nas Ta Bega, have you spoken my tongue to any other white man since you returned to your home?" asked Shefford. "No." "Why do you? Why are you different for me?" The Indian maintained silence. "Is it because of Glen Naspa?" inquired Shefford. Nas Ta Bega stalked on, still silent, but Shefford divined that, although his service to Glen Naspa would never be forgotten, still it was not wholly responsible for the Indian's subtle sympathy. "Bi Nai, the Navajo will call his white friend. Bi Nai, brother," said Nas Ta Bega, and he spoke haltingly, not as if words were hard to find, but strange to speak. "I was stolen from my mother's hogan and taken to California. They kept me 10 years in a mission at San Bernardino and 4 years in a school. They said my color and my hair were all that was left of the Indian in me, but they could not see my heart. They took 14 years of my life. They wanted to make me a missionary among my own people. But the white man's ways and his life and his God are not the Indian's. They never can be." How strangely productive of thought for Shefford to hear the Indian talk! What fatality in this meeting and friendship! Upon Nas Ta Bega had been forced education, training, religion that had made him something more and something less than an Indian. It was something assimilated from the white man which made the Indian unhappy and alien in his own home, something meant to be good for him and his kind that had ruined him. For Shefford felt the passion and the tragedy of this Navajo. "Bi Nai, the Indian is dying." Nas Ta Bega's low voice was deep and wonderful with its intensity of feeling. "The white man robbed the Indian of lands, of homes, drove him into the deserts, made him a gaunt and sleepless spiller of blood. The blood is all spilled now, for the Indian is broken, but the white man sells him rum and seduces his daughters. He will not leave the Indian in peace with his own God. Bi Nai, the Indian is dying." End of chapter 4, part 1.